Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Janet Cahill, and I am the Executive Director of External Relations, and it is great to welcome you today to the Harvard Business School Alumni Program, Building Your Scale Digital Organization, with Professor Karim R Lakhani and 4 distinguished alumni panelists. We have, I believe, over 1,400 alumni representing class years from the 1950s to the 2020s. Joining us today from many, many countries around the globe. And 80% of you said that your organizations were undergoing digital transformation. So certainly a very relevant topic where you will, I think, learn a lot from Karim and also our alumni, many of whom have gone through their own leadership journeys in managing digital transformation with their companies. This program, as you know, is part of our ongoing collection of virtual programs that we do with faculty. Please keep updated with the alumni website so you can learn about more programs that we have coming forward. Let me introduce Karim R Lakhani, who is my very dear friend, collaborator, and partner. He is the Dorothy and Michael Hinsey Professor of Business Administration. He co-chairs the school's digital initiative. He is the founder and co-director of the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard. He is the co-founder and co-chair of the Harvard Business Analytics Program. He led the dean's recent task force on digital transformation and is leading right now with Srikant the development of a digital data and design institute for the school. So needless to say, Karim is widely renowned for his research and his expertise in technology management, innovation, AI, and digital transformation. And he co-authored with Marco Ianciti, who's the co-chair of the digital initiative, a book called Competing in the Age of AI, Strategy and Leadership When Algorithms and Networks Run the World. So Karim, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to let you introduce our alumni guests today.
My Zoom game is off. Janet, thanks very much. I really appreciate the introduction. And I think co-conspirator is more the right term for you and I.
Perhaps.
We've been on this journey to sort of make HBS more digital and more relevant for this world. And it's been fascinating to have both Janet as a partner, ER as a partner. We were in the early days of that, with the announcement of Marco Ianciti as both the chair for technology and transformation of the school, but also as our acting chief digital officer for the school as well. So I think our new dean, Srikant, and the problem with him being my friend is that he asked me for lots of crazy things, is that he truly believes in the digitization mission. And is taking HBS on that journey. So if I could get the slide up with the profiles of our distinguished alums with me, and I'm so delighted. 3 I know really well, 1 is new, and so I'm really delighted that they all what's great about HBS alums is that when you ask them for a favor from the faculty, they mostly say yes. It's quite nice. So I'm delighted to be here with us. So first is Jimmy Allen, MBA 1989, senior partner, Bain and Company, lives in London, but has an American accent. And the English accent hasn't yet seeped in totally into Jimmy. Next is Bertrand Bodson, MBA 2003, member of the executive committee and chief digital officer at Novartis. And also an executive fellow at HBS. And actually, Bertrand has been helping tremendously with our own work on digital transformation here in many ways. Then Mina Hsiang, administrator now of US Digital Service at the White House. She is just around the corner in Somerville, Mass, but also I'm sure commutes to DC quite a bit. And then Michelle Zatlyn, MBA 2009, co-founder, president, and chief operating officer of Cloudflare, based out of San Francisco. She's also a fellow Canadian here. As in terms of disclosures, I had both Mina and Michelle as my students in my Tom RC class. I tried to convince both of them to stick around and do a PhD with me, but I think they found better alternatives elsewhere with greater things. And just again, in terms of context, I often want to sort of think about the organizations that are represented. So in terms of context, again, HBS, right? We're part of Harvard. We predate the U.S. Constitutional Republic. So our traditions, our institutions are super old. Then we have the U.S. Constitutional Republic represented by Mina. So Mina is part of a very old organization, also going through some very interesting transformation aspects of it. Then Novartis, comes next, probably about 100 years old if you sort of thought about all the companies that made it work. Jimmy Bain in the 70s or so, right? Founded in the 70s or so. And then Michelle with the company founded, on our campus, 2009, 2010 vintage as well. So we've got a tremendous set of folks with a tremendous degree of experience on this topic of building scaled digital organizations. Thank you for all the questions you sent us. I've shared it with them. Those questions have informed the conversation we're going to have. And what I'd like to do actually is kick it off with Jimmy. And get Jimmy to, Jimmy wrote a nice piece we'll put on the chat, we'll share with you as well, about sort of scaled insurgents. And when I read that, I go, okay, like he's reading my books and I'm reading his books, because I think there's a lot of concurrency in how we're thinking about the world. So Jimmy, why don't you sort of give us a definition of scaled insurgents, why this concept came about, and what you're seeing from your practice from Bain's view about this.
Great. So first, thanks very much, and glad to see how global this group is. It's amazing watching the chats come through, which is terrific. I guess I would start by saying, as we were looking at the turbulence our clients were facing, and what would you say about the future, it forced us to look historically at what happens to companies. And we basically concluded that roughly every 50 years, the nature of how we think about the firm dramatically changes. And so I'll give my history a little bit, class of 89 here, and I'm sorry to date me, but when I joined HBS, the way we would have described the history of business was as follows: that in many ways, the first book we read was Alfred Sloan's autobiography, introducing the idea of professional management. And professional management, let's all remember, was a specific reaction to the era that preceded it, which was the trust era, when you were looking at founder-led organizations that had gotten old and paradoxically anti-innovation. So Sloan was reacting to Henry Ford, who was so anti-innovation and disruption. And what Sloan argued is that we need to have institutions be taken over by professional managers. And they would have three attributes. The first of which is they would be dispassionate custodians of the business, meaning we're not going to name the next car after our daughters. We are going to be in charge of the institution. It was a fungible skill. Think about how HBS talks about it, that by learning the skills of leadership and management, you can rotate between functions, you could rotate between geographies, and even between industries and companies. And then the third thing, which most of us have discovered in our careers, is we're perfectly disposable. The idea is that if you have a cadre of professional management, if things break, you simply replace the one you got with another one. And then HBS led the era change. The era started to change in 1975 when a guy named Mike Jensen wrote an article. And he said, why are those GM guys, the poster children of professional management, why are they billing their country club memberships to the firm? And his answer was because they had no stake in the value they were creating. And the insight was, what if we took the skills of the professional manager and reorient them around shareholder value creation? Boom, another massive explosion in what we would consider creativity in business. We would talk about Jack Welch being one of the CEOs that made the transition from professional management to shareholder primacy. LBO industry, private equity was born. But for 100 years, we have depended upon the professional management system, the job of which is to systematically bring to customers the benefits of scale. It always had an Achilles heel, and it was the bigger we got, the more complex we got, and we slowed down to non-competitiveness. But that model was okay because the prevailing image was we were just moving up in boxing classes. If the featherweights competed against the featherweights, the middleweights competed against the middleweights, and the heavyweights slugged it out. Slow and purposeful, trying to win on the basis of scale. Then what emerged using technology was the rise of the scale insurgent. Companies that were able to compete on the basis of scale and speed. And the challenge that it presents to everybody as we move into this new era is not only do we have to learn how to compete on the basis of speed, but we have to begin to unlearn some of the issues around how to compete on scale. And I'll just give examples and then obviously turn over to the panelists that can talk about it in more detail. But you know, when I started off at Bain, we would talk about strategy as being one of perfect anticipation. You would try to predict the future. You would put scenarios, and none of you will remember, but there was a point at which you'd write a base case and people were fired if the base case didn't happen. Well, we've moved from anticipation to perfect adaptability, but the professional management system is not caught up. All of finance systems and HR systems are built on anticipation, not on adaptability. When you go to HBS, you learn the predominance of horizontal motions, strategy, operating model, complexity reduction. These are motions of the CEO aligning their teams and then hopefully cascading down. We learn the motion of horizontal. Well, to compete on speed, you have to discover the motion of vertical. I don't give a damn about what my strategy is. I need to win in China against competitor X tomorrow. And then maybe I will learn patterns that I can extrapolate horizontally. Push. We learn at Harvard. I don't know what you're doing now, but a lot of it is push. As a CEO, you develop the strategy and then you push it on your people. Our strategy is to achieve 100. Bob, you achieve 1x of that. Mary, you achieve 0.3 of x. But strategy now is about pull. How do you create the pull for change? How do you make technology changes meaningful to the front line and get them to pull what you want? And we are having to unlearn all this. For incumbents, the challenge is, can they discover speed? For a lot of insurgents on this call, it is, can you create a new way of scaling that doesn't rely on the professional management system? Because all you're doing is setting yourself up for a complexity trap. And the final thing I'll say is, when you're in an era change, which is obviously the most exciting thing on earth to be part of, you've got to get back to first principles. And the reason we establish firms is to debate endlessly about the three great conflicts of business on behalf of our customers. And sadly, we have forgotten what the hell I'm talking about. What are the three great conflicts of business? Well, the reason you put an organization together is to fight like hell on behalf of your customers for the benefits of scale versus intimacy. If I'm Unilever, I demand that my head of Indonesia fights for her consumers to deliver difference, spicier soup because she knows the Indonesian palate. But in the same debate, on behalf of the same consumer, I demand my head of supply chain argues for 5 kinds of mustard seed, not 50, to deliver to that consumer the benefits of scale or sameness. Routine versus disruption. I am flying now. I can promise you on my flights to Delhi, I don't want the pilot to say, welcome to the agile flight. I have all sorts of new ideas of how I'm going to land in Delhi. We demand 98.8% of what our customers demand every day is perfect execution of a known routine. And yet all of you on this call know that when and how you decide to disrupt yourself will determine the future value of your organization. So we set up those delivering routine, those delivering disruption in everything we do. The third conflict is we've got to run the business and change the business. Running the business demands the stabilization of the business to start an experience curve. Changing the business demands that we're constantly experimenting and failing as we try to come up with something new. As we talk about digital, as we talk about AI, what we are talking about is, how does that technology enable us, in order to compete on the basis of scale and speed, to resolve those three conflicts faster, smarter, and better? And that's what we're doing in this. So let me stop there and get on to the experts on digital.
Great. Thank you, Jimmy. That was great. It was a great way to sort of give us both the historical perspective as to how we've gotten to where we are, but also the current needs that we're faced with. So let's start with Michelle. Michelle, you know, in many ways, you are building, you know, according to Jimmy's definition, a scaled insurgent. So maybe you want to just reflect on your journey from its origins at HBS to the company you're at. And from what I recall, our early conversations, Cloudflare is not what you guys, I mean, it is in many ways doing what you guys had envisioned for, but the details look very different from what you might have even have imagined. And so maybe you want to give us your perspective, Michelle, on that.
Of course. Thanks so much for having me. Jimmy, I really enjoyed your remarks because I found myself nodding along a lot. Now, I'm lucky. I don't have a 100-year-old company that I have to transform. I got to start from scratch. However, I would say that I started my company at HBS with one of my section mates. And today we're a publicly traded company, a company called Cloudflare, and we help make the internet faster, safer, and more reliable for a lot of businesses around the world. We have about 2,500 people at Cloudflare. And we are, in many ways, as you were using your words, Jimmy, we are the definition of scale and speed. So let me give you some sense. So 2,500 people, we're only about 11 years old as a company. We just celebrated our 11th birthday. So for sure, successful as a startup, but nowhere near a legacy business or iconic company yet. That's what we're aiming for. We're very ambitious. But on the scale side, we, when we say we make the internet faster, safer, and more reliable, we power about 28 million web requests every second for our customers. For a relatively small company, if you add up 28 million per second, that's 2.4 trillion a day. So that's huge scale. We stop about 80 billion with a B cyber attacks on behalf of our customers daily. That's huge scale. But we're so agile. Every quarter, our team is like shipping over like 130 new products and features. And when I bring in new people into our organization, they don't understand how that's possible, because when they look at other organizations, that's not how it's done. And so it's super interesting to have, Jimmy's kind of frameworks. I think, wow, that's how we've built our business. It's very agile. It's but at huge scale. And so I guess point one is it's possible to do. And I do feel like we're winning because of that. And a lot of people look at us and say, how are you doing it? And so when I look back, and again, I know there's a lot of founders on the call, or maybe some of you are tasked with starting a new business unit within your organizations or tasked with some project. If I think back to like what's been really critical to our success and core to our success over time, it's step one is you got to solve a meaningful problem that delivers real value to your customers. You can't make this up, because all of this becomes a lot easier if you're getting pulled versus pushing, trying to convince somebody to do something. And for us, it just happens that every single organization needs to be faster and have better cybersecurity and more reliability online, because digital is becoming so important. So we're getting pulled into organizations. And so that forces you to go really quickly. It also forces you to solve these problems. And I do think there's something very rewarding for your team when they're tasked with solving a problem, when you solve it and there's actually like adoption by your customers, it becomes a very positive feedback loop. So the step one was solve a meaningful problem, like actually solve a problem that your customers have. And those customers could be external or internal, right? It could be an internal team. And if you make their lives better by a lot, and it's very obvious, it will pull through and it'll make all these digital transformation projects or the start of something a lot easier. The second point I'll make is around people. I do think that what's been really critical to us is having great people be part of this journey. And people is not just on the team. It means investors, like who do you take money from? It means who's on your board. All those stories that you read in the newspaper about boards being helpful to businesses or not helpful to businesses are true. And so you have to assemble the right board, the right investors if you're taking outside funding, and then you got to assemble the right leadership team and people on the team to then go execute on all of these things. And I'll just tell one story and then I'll pause and I'll give it over. And then once you hire the people internally, you got to empower them to make the decisions. And what's really interesting, if I look at Cloudflare, and this is just how we operate, we push decision-making very far out. We hire very smart people. We point them in the same smart direction. Of course, everyone has a boss. Everyone ladders up to somebody, but we empower people to be making decisions on behalf of the business on a daily basis. It's not their boss. And I'll just give you an example, and then I'll pause there and we'll go on. I'm sure we'll come back and dive into this more. But we're working with a very large organization on a very technical project where we're co-collaborating, bringing something to market. And it's so interesting. Their technical teams were taking notes and giving their feedback to their organization. It's a large global company who said, Cloudflare brings the product manager to the meeting, and the product manager can make the decision. They don't have to go back and check. They are empowered to make a decision, whereas we're bringing 5 people to the meeting and no one has the authority to decide. And I think that if you go back to Jimmy's comment of scale and speed, be the organization where the person, how many people have to go to the meeting to decide? And I think you want it to shrink. You want fewer people there and you want to give them the responsibility to make a decision. They might not always make the right decision, but that's okay. That's how you gain the muscle memory or the tissue to do it again, because business is a series of smart decisions over time, not one really brilliant decision that then everyone lines up behind. It's how fast can you like constantly be navigating what you're doing. So maybe I'll pause there and we can come back. But I loved your remarks, Jimmy. I think we're very lucky. We're kind of a born on the cloud company, helping enable a lot of other organizations through this, and excited and happy to answer any questions along the way.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. That was great. And I just want to reflect on the point you made, which is sort of the decision-making ability in our workers, in our employees, in our teams. And all of us spend bazillions of hours hiring the right people, right? Like just putting them through massive amounts of work in hiring the right people. So we've hired the right people, but then we don't give them anything to actually make decisions. Like we still want to then filter the decisions up into some bureaucratic mess to do things. And I often say, one of my big realizations when I was working at General Electric was nothing I would do would ever bankrupt GE. Like I was not in a role that would ever bankrupt. And if you think about it within your company as well, most of the decisions that are going to be made aren't going to bankrupt Cloudflare. If that happens, there's something structurally wrong with your company, right? And so then the ability to be able to just make the decisions, keep going, and learn from the mistakes, both for the individual but for the organization, is very powerful. But most organizations don't live what you guys are living at this moment. All right, Bertrand, your perspective from a view of you've had a very interesting career being at Amazon when you finished up at HBS, and then going starting your own company and then working at Novartis. Tell us what you've learned about this, and especially your experience at Novartis as their Chief Digital Officer.
Yeah, I think it's probably picking up on Michelle. It's probably a very different starting point because it's a 200 billion business. There's a few more years basically in the bag in many ways. I think we have scaled in many ways, but part of the challenge was how do we find the right speed? To me, a lot of it, and I think there are also a lot of incumbents, if I can call it that way, on the calls, we probably all are in some shape or form, was how do you first of all pick the right timing as well to get those and mobilize the right, I call it political will, to really get going on this. I think if you don't have that, you don't even stand a chance. In our case, we are fortunate in healthcare that data, technology, science have been converging in many ways. When you see Microsoft, when you see Amazon, when you see Google all getting into that space, at least it creates some form of tension of how do we bring the best of all those worlds to come in there. I think there was, I joined in 2017, 18, there was a massive political will where the board said, look, enough is enough, now it's time that we take this on. It became one of the top 5 priorities company-wide. But I generally believe you need that political will. Karim, I'll be happy to share an example about Estonia as well afterwards if it's of interest, but yeah, where there was a massive political will to digitalize a country almost on 120 million. If a country can do it, I hope that an organization like ours can do that. Michelle, to your point, there were also a lot of big problems to take on. When you think about healthcare, it's in the US, it's 15% of GDP. In most countries, it's between 10 and 15. There's probably 30% inefficiency in this. To get a drug to market, think about the context of COVID. In normal times, it takes 12 years and $2.5 billion. 12 years, $2.5 billion to get that. So something is wrong with that equation somewhere. And probably worse, from a patient point of view, you have patients on chronic disease more than 8 years to really be diagnosed on the treatment and to be on the treatment on which it should be. And even then, when they get diagnosed, we lose another 40% of patients who never really adhere to the medication. So surely there must be a better way to get to that. So there is scale, but a lot of what we had was how do we really bring some speed into that? And practically speaking, the first 3 months were all about getting things going, finding the traction. We launched what we call the 12 lighthouses, so 12 mega programs to some extent across the organization. Doesn't mean big as such, but 12 was not a magic number, but it wasn't 3, so that it's not enough to really get going. It wasn't 200, so that it's really diluted. as an executive committee, it was really how do we all hands together so that, and we allocate the right budget so that we can touch enough part of the organizations to get some short-term wins, to get some long-term platform builds that needs to be in there, and we affect all areas of the organization. I think the casting was also equally important to us. So how do we put some of the hidden gems? How do we put some of the talents behind each of those sort of lighthouses as a way, a bit to your point earlier, Karim, a bit as a way to unlock some people who may not get the breathing space otherwise, and to say, look, okay, shine, show us what you can do, get the speed, you get the mandate now, we're taking the budget issue off the table to some extent, showcase what you can do. And I think that leads us to ultimately, certainly a big learning for me for the last 10 years has been 50% of those jobs in digital transformation in broader institutions are cultural shifts. So it's really about how do you get 100,000 people on board? How do you demystify what the hell this stuff is really about? How do you keep it simple enough? How do you speak about it in terms of customer terms as opposed to too much lingo and making it more complex than it really should be? That's probably the hardest part. And Jimmy, to your point, it's the professional managers. We had a lot of hard calls to make in the top 300, 1.5 years down the line. We probably had 150 that were really left because it was equally a cultural transformation that really just a digital transformation. And maybe one piece I would add is also the capacity in our case to make bold moves fairly early. And those are the scariest one. Karim, you're right, very few of us can bankrupt an organization. And I think it requires a few bold moves to also showcase that we're serious about that. So in our case, we made some fairly meaningful acquisition into new platforms. We made a 10 billion acquisition into some totally new platforms that we hadn't necessarily considered before. We looked at bigger partnership with Microsoft, with Amazon, which made a few of us uneasy at first. It was like, are you sure those are not the competition? Are we giving all the IP away? Are you sure they're not the evil tech masters basically that come afterward? I have a strong conviction that you cannot do it alone. So how do you really build the right partnerships to be able to do that? And then we got a bit of luck to some extent is also to benefit from some of the things that happened in the world. When COVID happened, clearly a hard one for all of us, but it accelerated everything. It accelerated the way that telemedicine came up. It got all the stakeholders, regulators, FDA to come to the party as well. Doctors could interact with patients in a very different way. So how do we get ready and able to really use that as a vehicle for speed in a massive, massive way? So I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but I think it has been fascinating, and I'm equally obsessed as Jimmy about the notion of scale and how do you really build the speed through partnership, through bold moves, through programs that are where you hold hands and having the right political wills to go after them.
Great. Thank you so much, Bertrand. Now on to Mina. And, I was just looking up the budget for the US government, and it's, I think it's like $6.6 trillion. And much of that is going to flow through whatever Mina builds as part of US digital services. So Mina, maybe a slightly bit about your background, because you didn't start off in government. You were in many other enterprises, and then this role that you're taking on, and then this notion of sort of scale digital organizations, and how do we get the US government to be that way as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you noted, I mean, my background is some amalgamation of sort of private sector and public sector. I've been interested in government. My internship at HBS was actually in government, which is sort of a very odd duck thing to do. But, I spent the first 17 years of my career building in healthcare primarily, first building medical devices, then building data systems as a venture capitalist, helping start companies across those sectors. And so a lot of what I do now is trying to bring, exactly what we're talking about here. So those best practices from across industry into government and helping us achieve exactly what Jimmy was outlining. So, as you were highlighting some of the dichotomies of business, that was really resonating with me, this whole question of scale versus intimacy, right? So government processes need to, the question of safety versus disruption. So we need to be able to deliver services for people at critical times for literally anybody who shows up and everyone in the country. And yet we're a critical part of extremely intimate moments, right? You have a baby and you have to register for a social security number, and then that social security number has to pull through to your taxes, and it has to pull through to many other systems. So there's like a notion where it fits in with all of our lives at critical moments. And at the same time, and it has to fit in, right? As our lives evolve and how we operate in the rest of our lives evolves, it still has to fit into that, but it has to operate at nationwide, highly reliable scale. So to take a step back from sort of the like intimate moments, the whole process and infrastructure of government, as is not surprising, is kind of the antithesis of agile, right? So it's the identify a problem. You know, Michelle commented on how you have to have a significant problem. A lot of legislation, for example, addresses real problems that are understood, and we can talk about. I'll talk in a minute about some of the things that have recently happened. But you have a bunch of people who sort of take in a lot of information from out in the world, but write a prescription for here's what we're going to do to address this problem. It gets passed into a bill. It gets put into an agency where they then have to run a process to write regulations to determine how we're going to execute against that. And at some point in there, you also have to build the systems to operationalize that. And the whole process of building and procuring those systems is also governed by a lot of complicated linear waterfall processes. So the question of how, in this current environment where everything else is changing so quickly and no one else operates that way, how do you shift on that when we know that that's not the best way to get the right outcomes, right? And so US Digital Service, we started about 7 years ago, and our key task is to impedance match some of the best capabilities from the private sector in digital, primarily in things that are dependent on technology. But as everyone here knows, that is most services at this point. To bring those capabilities and combine them with the critical elements of government and help sort of supercharge and figure out what is our new model for operations moving forward. And a few things have happened in the last couple of years that have really supercharged that effort. First, you know, the world got disrupted. So the need for sort of social support structures, the need to have more, I won't say government intervention, I will say government intervention. The need for government to play its role in providing sort of a social backstop in a lot of contexts, but also the need to adapt to a lot of disruption across the world, right? So the world got disrupted. There was so many problems to solve and opportunities to engage. The world went online. So in a world, you know, government services aren't typically thought of as like the most satisfying digital experiences, I would say. And that, you know, we're working on shifting that. But as the entire world went online, as people needed to get social services in an online context, as people who work at government agencies need to do case management and exchanges between one caseworker and another, and that all needs to happen online and can't happen on paper anymore. That's a huge motivating force for change, right? And then third, frankly, people across the economy are seeking meaningful work. The world stepped back and sort of said, we want to do things that are high impact, that feel important to me. And so we know I hire a lot of people, some people from government and some people from the private sector. You know, Michelle talked about it, her company. I bet you guys deploy software at least hundreds of times per day. I mean, it's a continuous process. A lot of places that we go in government have extremely legacy technology supporting critical systems, and they deploy, I'll say very infrequently, like on the order of months or once a year sometimes. And it's a huge difference. And so we bring together people who have a background where they understand how you build structures that allow for sort of continuous improvement, and how do you build sort of the appropriate team dynamics? How do you build the appropriate information flows and decision-making processes to operate in an extremely dynamic environment? And then we also have sort of our teammates who operate in a more standard bureaucratic government environment. And the question is, how do you find the appropriate middle path? As Jimmy said, on, you know, all of these points of tension, how do you make sure that you don't lose your ability to deliver key services? At the same time, implementing new programs using the same processes, for example, for technology, is probably the riskiest path, right? Because we know how that will turn out. And so then the question is, how do we chart a new path forward on how do we operationalize and build teams in government that do that? So we know, you know, the best strategy is iterative. The best execution is iterative. If we're looking to solve problems, the best way for us to actually solve those problems is to measure the problems continuously, work with users, and sort of be evaluating our progress against them. But that isn't how government typically works. And so we have to do a lot of work to sort of help teach. So the way that we do that is sort of two big buckets. And Karim, you can tell me whenever you want me to stop talking. But one is sort of bringing in a whole bunch of people who know what this looks like, and they exist in government too. So one of my favorite examples is, Stanley McChrystal's team of teams. That's another good instance of how do you build distributed systems, distributed teams who can operate very quickly and do decision making at the edge, but also share consciousness, right? So we bring in folks who understand how to do this. We embed them in agencies to sort of show what good looks like and combine the work product together to say, how do we together build a system that meets all of our needs? And then the other big piece of work that we're working towards, right, is institutionalizing, making that the standard, not making it something where you have to be like a special snowflake with like exceptional executive buy-in, but how do we make high quality iterative delivery by design as opposed to sort of the exception? So how do we make it the rule? And so, a tremendous amount of opportunity right now in the government, a lot of appetite, both on the government side and frankly, from people who are interested in figuring out how to collaborate and help. And I think there's just a lot of work to do. So I'm excited about the questions and where we're going to take this discussion.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm going to bring everybody onto Spotlight so everybody can see everybody together. And I'd love for us to first just one reflection as I was sort of launching the digital transformation task force work at HBS. The thing that sort of hit me, we were looking across the entire enterprise, is that nothing we do today at HBS doesn't involve software. Like everything we do is mediated through technology, every single thing. But the interesting thing for HBS is that we have this massive investment in our physical infrastructure. Our physical infrastructure is incredible. People come in and it's like Disneyland, right? What a not Hogwarts type, Oxford type, but it still is like a modern business school. And what it looks like is our infrastructure, is the physical infrastructure. But the same care, attention, love on the digital infrastructure has been missing in many ways. And like this aha was like, everything we do is going to be in software, is in software. And we need to then sort of make sure that we are as good at building buildings and maintaining our property as we are in building and maintaining our software infrastructure and our digital infrastructure. There's a big misconnect. And with that, I think is this question I think that Bertrand raised, which is like culture, right? Like culture is what's going to make this change and happen. But what I'm worried about is, so I've got I see Boris Gorsberg from our OB unit is on one of the listeners here, is like oftentimes like we say culture change, but like how? Like what? Like okay, like I can take you to a re-education camp, right, and say you got to change and but like that's not going to work. So what is the model for culture change that I think is needed in these complex organizations? And so I'd love to start with Jimmy, get your perspective, and then go around. And with Michelle, what I want to ask her is, she's growing rapidly, the company's growing rapidly. So ossification and being stuck in the vintage you were founded is super high. So how are they working towards making sure that they stay agile instead of ossifying? So Jimmy first, so this culture change story, what do you see?
So I think, the short answer is of course it is about culture, but the world needs another transformation program, culture transformation program, like a hole in the head. Meaning yes. The way not to deal with it is we are going to become faster. A group of bureaucrats deciding on a culture program to become faster. So the way in which you have to do it is intensely vertical, by actually getting stuff done, demonstrating use cases, making heroes out of the people that execute it, make them richer or their lives easier, so they then as influencers tell their friends and buddies and pull through the change. Change management, just after 30 years of leading HBS, change management is what you do when you're wrong and you have to force bad ideas through an organization that knows better. That's change management. Cultural change that is required is we win vertically, we figure out what it is, we create the use cases, and then go from there. But it is also about deep skill change. And you said, do you have to go to some re-education camp? Sort of. And I'll give you one example from our work with founders. But if you think about what it means to build businesses, the great mythology is business building is about ideation or incubators. That's the commodity. That when you look at business building, there are three communities that get involved. If you have the right culture, the heroes are always the execution community. They keep our customer promises every day. They're out there in the field. In a world of disruption, we love to talk about the disruptive community and say, how do we do more with them? How do we create more disruptors? Every founder will say every incumbent has more ideas to make $1 trillion. You've got enough. What is missing is disruptors live in a world of Post-it notes. Executors live in a world of playbooks. You need a bridge, and that is a scaler. A scaler is a specific skill of how do you take ideas that already exist and test them for transferability, figure out how to deploy them, how to create the pull in the organization for change. So what is it that makes a salesman want to adopt this and a salesperson? What makes them want to pull it through? That is the hardest skill in business. That is why Amazon, their #1 business definition is a business builder. That is why all of the scale insurgents that are emerging talk about scaling, not ideation and incubation. Ideation and incubation are the hobbies of incumbents who don't know what they're talking about. It is literally come and see, how many clients have I gone to, which is we are now fully adopting Agile. Let me take you to my Agile factory, which is obviously run by 3M, the manufacturer of Post-it notes. It starts with notice I don't have ceiling panels. You can see the pipes above, and then watch all my Agile teams. And then I say, how have you scaled Agile? And they say, well, we had 5 teams and now we have 1,000. No, scaling Agile is we have a new business that competes with our declining core. That is what we're talking about. So yes, culture change, but it comes vertical, but don't underestimate that a change of era requires we will reskill our people. And the way we talk about it is the job of leadership is to hold a grand audition. We can promise that we will hold an audition. We can coach for everybody to get a role, but we can't guarantee it. They are going to have to perform in the new roles, but we can coach and do it. But the idea that it's culture change alone is the great mythology of all the people proposing central-driven change management and culture programs.
Yeah, the joke that I always say is like change management is change management, right? Change the management. If you hear management say change management, then it should be change the management.
And I'll tell you one quick thing, and then I'll shut up. And I'm sorry, but the whole story of the Microsoft turnaround, incumbents have seized on it because the CEO says you start with culture, but he didn't. He started by winning in customer after customer after customer and showing that there was a new way to operate and using those testimonials. And then from the pattern recognition of winning in the marketplace, he developed the cultural change. All the incumbents here is culture change. And they launch a culture program. Yeah. Oh my God, we don't even learn the lessons that are actually out there.
Yeah. All right, Bertrand, what are you going to do about you're the one that raised the scepter of culture change. What do you think? Is Jimmy onto something, or is it going to like blow up if it shows up in Novartis?
Jimmy, I like how we got you on fire there. I like your energy around this.
I love it.
No, you're definitely onto something. And maybe on your point, Jimmy, it's like one of the illusions we often create is an industry of pilots. And you have plenty of pilots that are subscale, and actually you get the illusion that you're doing well because you have plenty of innovative agile teams actually going, but they're not connected to the core whatsoever. It doesn't really move the dial. So it's pilots is probably something I've been, as much as we're all geared in digital transformation, so let's do a pilot. I think that it has a certain limit, if not really attached to the core. I think maybe, Karim, one thing that I found incredibly helpful over the years, look, I have plenty of scars on my body on those type of setup, and there are plenty of things where I just don't know yet how to best handle it. But one thing I found very useful to accelerate digital transformation and to shift the culture is partnerships. And what I mean by that is, and I'm a massive against big vendors, relationship at arm's length that gets messy, where you never agree, but true partnerships. And we have some, for example, with Tencent in China. It was highly controversial at first when we started, but where they have effectively boots on the ground. They started by giving us almost 50 people in sweat equity with us, embedded into a few particular areas we wanted to think about very differently. Likewise, we've done similar like partnership in data science and AI with Microsoft, Jimmy, to your point, and with Amazon. We've done about 30 of those over the last 4 years as such. What I love in those partnerships is when you really get some of your team, some of their team coming together to the point that you don't even know who is from Tencent, who is from Novartis, and they really gel well together. When you get the same effect with an Amazon style, I think you're onto something, because then you get to learn from them. That's natural curiosity. You get to learn, I don't know, the Amazon culture of how do you do what they call a PR FAQ. So how do you write a plan 5 years out, not so much a linear or horizontal plan as you were describing earlier, but how would they, in the shoes of a customer, see Prime 5-10 years from now? And then you work everything backwards, you align your resource, you ramp up your teams very differently to be able to get to that goal. It's messy, you really don't know how to get to that, but at least you're drawing the North Star of where you want to go from that. We all talk about the Amazon 2 Pizza teams, or Tencent is incredible, the way they set up the different divisions, how they bring gamification into healthcare, how they make some acquisitions that from the outside don't make much sense, but when you look into it, it's actually fascinating. I love those partnerships because we learn from them, and it has the hidden agenda that it transforms your own culture, because our own guys get exposed to that. We get to see some of the gaps we have in some of the skills we should really have. We see what really good data science and AI really looks like in that type of setup. We see some of the mistakes they are making as well, because maybe they are lacking some of the scientific questions to be grounded in. Take an IBM has made a lot of big promises as well on Watson that I haven't fully realized, and I've learned a lot from that. I think it's a combination of those two things that really span very, very well together. So I'm a massive fan of those, and I think it works in any industry, surprisingly. We always think that we are the only one where it wouldn't, because our questions are so unique. Healthcare would be a good defender of that, and it's really not the case. I think technology, data science are really coming together. I think I have a good friend who might be on the call, Paul Fribourg, who's family business, super impressive, has been running for 6 generations, and he's running a group called CGC, so on the control on grains. And at the same time, while they have poultry businesses, food businesses, they have at the same time investment into the likes of Impossible Food, and they're obsessed. His mindset is, how do I get Impossible Food to disrupt my business? And not so much on the outside, but really bring them in together and collapse those two things. How can I create the investment in Burger King? How do I create the Impossible Whopper, for example? So the best of those two combinations. I think it shifts the way that people think. It gets into what customers really want at the end of the day in many ways. So again, big fan of those partnerships. So what would be in each of our industries, partnerships that can really move the dial and change the culture from outside in basically that way.
Mina, your perspective, I mean, should we put an asterisk against, more than 100-year-old organizations, trying to do this change, like, and maybe put that on HBS as well. But like, what's your sense like of both the partnership story, which I think is true in terms of USDS set up to bring in people from the outside, but this broader change about, I don't even know if the Sloanian sort of professional management applies even to HBS or to the US government, like to like a university, old university, or to government. So like, what's your sense? And now that you're in sort of this front lines, because you have a digital mandate, but part of that is going to be the cultural change that needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Jimmy's notion. We say all the time, you have to show, don't tell. Like, you can tell people how to think about things, but at the end of the day, you get down in the trenches together, you execute on a project, you have to create the space. So there's a little bit of building sufficient trust so that people are willing to travel the new path together. But you execute the project together, you take on some of the risk that people are concerned about, and you show, don't tell. And then you say, these are the metrics that we need to be looking at. We are all going to look at them together every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday and evaluate how our consumers are doing at getting, first call resolution on customer service metrics. And once you do that for long enough together and that you can start moving the needle, that breeds culture. I think the other really critical piece of this is understanding the old culture, right? Deeply. Like you have to understand what motivates people. You have to really be a good listener. I had one of my transformational HBS moments sitting in two of Karim's different classes, one around innovation and one where we were talking about the Toyota system. So I have an engineering background, engineering parents, engineering grandparents. And so I came to HBS and we're talking about how innovation and sort of iterative development happens. And the whole class was very intuitive to me on the subject matter. And I turned around and learned from my classmates how everyone else thought it happened. And that was like the aha moment for me that was like, oh, everyone else doesn't know. This isn't like water for them. And I think that's critical also in these transformational situations. You have to deeply understand what the motivations of the incumbent individuals are and what they care about so that you can actually help shape the transformation to really be moving for them and the culture to sort of meet their inherent needs while also showing them how they can be met by a new system of operations.
Great. Right, Michelle?
Yeah, I was just going to say that this conversation is super interesting. So we're not a 100-year-old organization yet, but we work with all these.
That's your ambition though, right? To be around for a long time.
Yeah, of course. Yes. We're very long-term focused. That's what we're 11 years into our journey. But we work with all these large organizations. 20% of the Fortune 1000 are Cloudflare customers. So I actually kind of see a breadth of customers of how organizations react. And again, if they're using our service, they have something online, which every single company does. So there's something internet connected. And so it's interesting. There's a lot of things that I would just maybe punch up in what has been said. So Bertrand spoke about partnerships. What's interesting is, here's like something very practical. A lot of your organizations send out RFPs. And they're asking for very specific information, and that's fine. But actually what the best organizations do, here's the problem, and they find a vendor to collaborate with on the problem. And they don't even have to commit to buying from that vendor until they're like, actually, now I'm convinced that you can solve it. Then I'll commit to buy from you. So it's almost like a variation. It's the broadest definition of Bertrand's partnership. You don't even have to go do a formal partnership. You can just say, here is my business problem. Put it out to some external parties that you might want to work with and find the team that you collaborate with, because that we see organizations doing that all the time. And our teams almost end up becoming extensions of each other. And the biggest compliment I get from customers is when they say, hey, your team is like extensions of our team. And I love that because they rely on us to bring the innovation and the technical expertise, but we partner with their organization. And it's not a formal partnership. It's a vendor relationship, but it's different than an RFP where it's mask and I don't want to know who it's blind. So there is something about, I think not all large organizations are figuring out how to partner externally with vendors. And I think some of the best are the ones who are saying, here's my business problem I got to solve. And I need to go look externally to see if there's someone who can help me with it. And then go talk to them like people. And it's like, if problems are just people collaborating both internally and externally to solve the problem, I think that's super interesting. So that's something that I just see. The second thing I would say is this idea of finding a problem to solve is so hard. It's really, searching for problems is never good. It's much better when you have a problem, even if it's small or big. Being very specific is much easier to find a path forward, because what Jimmy said and what Mina said, and Bertrand, it's all about showing, not telling. And so you want to be able to, if you have a real pain point, then you can show solutions, then it just makes the next one easier versus some big thing where we're going to do all of this thing. It's going to take 5 years, way too slow. You got to find something kind of smaller, make progress against it. And then people's appetite is to go to the next thing. And then just the third point I will say, which hasn't been brought up, which I think is not obvious. In my world, it's so obvious, but it's not obvious to the industry yet, but I think it becomes a superpower. You don't have to solve the problem for everyone on day one. You can start a beta or a booster starter pack or some other thing that with some cover, call it something different. So it's not has to be for every single person. It's people opting into something smaller. And if that becomes, people will opt into it. Consumers, customers, internal employees. And if that's successful, then you can roll it out more broadly. And I think that in entrepreneurship, you do these crowdsourced fundings or product hunt where you get initial early beta users. Like betas are like an entrepreneur's best friend because you can try something, get early feedback, and then you can launch it for everybody else. And I think lot of larger organizations are starting to do the same thing where they cleave it off and they start just to try it. And restaurants have been doing this for a long time. They start in a couple stores, they make sure it works before they scale it everywhere. And I think this idea of you don't have to make it work for everyone on day one. If you like, a lot of large organizations start with like a beta or a booster, they call it something different, and it's people opt into it. And if it's successful, then they scale it up or more broadly. And then it's a lot easier of a problem to solve. And again, it's back to you solve the problem, you make momentum. Great, you have momentum, and momentum is a very powerful force for moving things forward, moving the ball down the court. I used to play basketball, so anyhow, those are just some comments that I would see working with these large organizations, of the ones who are able to make progress, move things along, feel like they're in good place, versus the ones who just talk and actually don't show anything because they can't get things done.
Yeah.
Karim, just jumping in on one thing that I think is interesting, and also kind of goes back if you're talking about how you repurpose HBS for a moment, which is that there's a fundamental tension that I don't think we've explored enough between what makes great cultures and what makes great partners, because currently they are completely incompatible. I think if Michelle were honest here, and I think Bertrand would agree with this, as would Mina, when you join a very, very powerful culture that creates a cultural identity of the organization, makes you feel proud to be part of it, there is an unintended consequence that it often makes you the worst partner to your ecosystem, not the best, because there's a natural arrogance that builds in that says we are always going to do it slightly better. So the reason that Michelle gets RFPs is notwithstanding the fact that no one who's writing the RFP has a clue what they need or what they want. They are convinced they do, and that Michelle's job is to align in and to admit, as a 100-year organization or a 40-year organization, that you can learn from outside partners, almost challenges the nature of what a culture is. And if it's often asked you, what would I want to relearn at HBS? I would want a course that says, how do you create a culture that makes you a partner of choice for the ecosystem, not the partner of last resort? And it's not easy, because the natural, what we learn as culture builders is effectively to create almost an us versus them mentality. We concede that our customers are always right, but to then concede that partners, peers of ours in our ecosystem, that we can learn from them is very different, very difficult culturally for a lot of organizations. And Michelle, I would just say for you, as you're scaling, notwithstanding the fact that you see this problem with your customers, I can almost guarantee you'll fall into the trap that your company will be so confident of its own success that it won't partner with its own ecosystem. It's just the trap we go into. And how do you prevent that so that you can do what Bertrand said, which I think is 100% right? Your best cultural change will come by your openness up to the ecosystem and people coming in.
And Jimmy, we see this movie repeat every time over. Like Microsoft won the PC wars, lost the internet, lost mobile, right? Because they didn't know how to partner. They actually weren't a great partner because it took all the profits in the industry for themselves, right? And weren't willing to share the value that was being created. And then and something that had to sort of unlearn all of that and then do the play in the cloud that they've done. So on this point of unlearning, so one of the great things. I have a privilege of being a professor at HBS, especially when you're tenured, is that you can ask controversial questions that go against the dogma. So one of the things I learned at graduate school was this great article about drop your tools. And it's really based on this notion of the Man Gulch fire, in which firefighters in the middle of a pretty bad inferno could see a safety spot. And their leader said, drop your tools and run, because you're going to lose weight and get the speed you need to get there. And none of them dropped their tools, because the tools was what made their identity, made them the firefighters that they were. And dropping your tools is very difficult. And in many ways, I think we're at this stage of dropping tools for lots of our organizations, lots of ourselves as well. So what tools from HBS? We'll just keep it among us and the 400 people that are here. Would you drop now, Jimmy?
I'll start. I've given a lot of thought about this, and I apologize for everybody on the call because I don't know what HBS has taught after 1989. So this is an old opinion.
Yeah, we need you to come back and take some exec ed with us. Yes,
exactly. The whole problem of the case system teaches the exact opposite behavior of what's needed in the future, which is we learn to read a case in 12 to 14 minutes and then pontificate. And we learn two skills, which are bureaucratic skills, and you only realize when you see the opposite. Bureaucrats make problems bigger. Insurgents make problems smaller. We have a pricing issue in China. A bureaucrat would say, we don't have a pricing issue in China. It's a problem of how the product organization and matrix organization are working together, requiring a thorough review of the operating model and an 18-month organization redesign. An insurgent would say, we don't have a problem with China pricing. It's 4 products, 3 stores. Everybody get on the call and solve it. And the case method too often trains you in the act of finding, we all knew how to do it, the chip shot that rose and elevated the issue so that it scored a lot of blackboard points, but actually it teaches you a skill that you're taking the problems out of the room of the decision making. Second, in bureaucratic organizations, the opposite of simple is advanced. In insurgent organizations, the opposite of simple is complex. And there is a world of difference. If the opposite of simple is advanced, anybody with a new idea advances the thinking. I have a new idea for a budget for a slide in a budget template. It's more advanced. I have to say yes. I have a new idea for a new step in our innovation process. More advanced. I want to form a committee to study the role of committees. More advanced. But if the opposite of simple is complex, somebody is screaming, all of these advanced ideas are adding cost to our consumer. Will someone call her and see if she wants to pay for them? And the issue that we're not teaching is how do we rid the organization of clever people that, in the words of Cal Newport, are creating shallow work for everybody and keep people focused on the deep work, which is the thing each of us does each and every day in our organization to fulfill the insurgent mission, uniquely leveraging your talent, and everything else is shallow work. If for goodness sake, HBS taught that skill and not just pontification, making the problem bigger and making the problem more advanced, you go a long way.
That's awesome. And this is the 100th anniversary of the case. So I think that feedback is very helpful. I mean, for us as educators and for all of us who sort of believe in this participant-centered learning model, but actually with these new realities that we're all faced up with.
It's so interesting. This is not your answer, but let me just because one of the things, as you were talking, Jimmy, I was thinking about, okay, when I hire senior executives to come work at Cloudflare, what skills do we have to unteach them? And it's so interesting that, like, for senior people, when we bring in a VP or like a senior role into our company, the 2 most common skills that people have to unlearn is a lot of leaders come in and they lead by pointing out everything is broken and that they're so important, they're here to fix it. So it's a little bit, and I'm always like, well, that's just opportunity. That's potential to grow faster if we fix that. And it's like, why can't you lead with more optimism and communicate with optimism? Well, it's not broken. We just haven't gotten to it yet, or it's what's going to be next. And great, you're here to help solve it. It's interesting. So that recalibration is important. And the second thing that I see as we've brought in a lot of senior leaders from other organizations to join our company as we scale is everything becomes, I need more headcount, I need more budget to solve this problem. And it's like, well, constraints are good. Constraints cause innovation. How do you find a way with what you're given? And I feel like those are 2 skills, just like practically that, and maybe for the founders on the call, just so you can see what you're going to come up against. But those are 2 skills where I feel like we have to unteach them from these seasoned execs who come into our organization, where it's like, that just doesn't work in our scale and speed environment at Cloudflare, like that they have to unlearn. And I was just talking to one of our senior execs, and the idea is like, I don't know, the best way to unlearn is you let them make decisions with the guard, and you they get bumped up against the organization and they have to go through that wash cycle a couple of times, and hopefully they're still here at the other end. And then they learn, they're like, hey, this is how it gets done here. And they've unlearned it themselves. You can't convince someone to unlearn it. They got to do it themselves. I think Adam Grant has a great book about how you can't change people's minds. The only way to change people's minds is really for them to decide to change their minds, them to realize it. Is interesting. So that's that. My thing that I would unlearn is discounted cash flows, not because they're not important, but I just think in the world of growth, they don't capture the opportunity. And I think that there's a lot of smart investors and people out there who are missing the huge shift happening right now, and they're going to miss out on profits because of it, because the DCF is totally bonked, doesn't work, doesn't make sense. And so I think a lot of businesses, I think companies are going to get disrupted and people are going to miss out on a lot of things because of the DCF model. So I think it's fine. I just think there's another way to think about growth and value and creating something strategic, which maybe isn't measured by revenue today, but one day could be. I think that is a whole skill set that specifically right now, because I think there is a huge shift going on, that would be very valuable to a lot of people.
Right. Michelle, what was the book you mentioned? The Think Again book, what was it? The book?
Oh, Think Again by Adam Grant. I can put it in the chat room. It's great. It's how do you get, I mean, this is Adam's terrific. He's at Wharton, but he's in organizational behavior. And it's just, how do you get people to rethink, and what should you be rethinking as a leader? And I think really he started by, how do you get other people to change their mind? And very quickly you realize you can't. You can't. So the book is more about how you think again. And it's very good.
Yeah, great, Michelle. All right, Mina, what tools are you going to drop?
I would say, I would call it the traditional leadership curriculum. Like the whole notion of like getting on a pedestal and like, how do you lead? It's kind of like the same thing that Jimmy was saying about change management. I think, leadership is now like, how do you catalyze a large assortment of small teams to like tell you what is the best thing that you all should be doing? And like, yes, you set a direction, like we're going to go that way. I see like a lot of opportunity, but it's really much more interactive, much more like, it's much more about like, how does feedback flow in both directions? And how do you make sure that everyone is developing like a common picture of what's going on? And there's just a lot of both how you think about it and the tactics that I don't, I think that the traditional like leadership conversation just doesn't encompass. And I think that there's a lot of that actually would come from, I'll take it a step further from what Jimmy was saying. And I said this while I was at HBS, I think more hands-on, like doing projects. And I think some of these leadership skills will come out of having to navigate actual hands-on projects with your peers, right? Yeah. In a way that sort of the case method where you're kind of lobbing ideas at each other just really doesn't force you to do. And I think leadership programming has sort of struggled in the case method as well. So I think there's like a bunch of pieces there, but I would change how we think about leadership.
No, there's I think there's a big element of doing. I think that has come into the school. I've been at the school 15 years, and the joke I was making with the panelists before we went live was, I joined in 2006. Did my PhD across the river, and like the entrepreneurship club at HBS was a fan club instead of like actually people who wanted to be entrepreneurs. Part of it was because of both the selection of who was coming in at HBS, but also part of it was that there wasn't enough doing around entrepreneurship that the school had. And in the last 15 years, that has changed radically in terms of there's much more doing types of classes that are out there. But I think we need to complement sort of this new view of what a case should try to do with the doing, and that has to be put side by side. And I think that's the huge opportunity in front of the school. And certainly now with this, our ability to now run a hybrid classroom, may allow us in the future to have students who don't necessarily have to be on campus all the time to be doing stuff in the world and then reflecting back with the classes and so forth. So I think those are the kind of things that I think are or what does a doing case look like? I don't know yet, but I think those are some interesting things for us to go after. Bertrand, what tools are you going to drop?
The first one, I think you hinted to it, was really simplify. It's like the more time goes by, the more simple becomes beautiful in many ways. I see prime time at Novartis with some of the best brains we can dream of. We have a lot of ex-McKinsey people. It's way too smart for our own goods, and we make everything way too complex. Whereas you really should go to the bottom of the issue. I think entrepreneurship, to your point, Karim, is really a big antidote, I think, to that in many ways, because you just don't have that luxury. You don't have that time to pontificate in many ways. Personally, there are things I'm still learning where I still don't know how to always get it right. It's actually kill your own babies or kill your own project as well, because you have things that are really smart on paper. You want to defend them. I was hinting earlier to talk lighthouses. The hardest thing to do is actually often to kill some of those fairly early on, we don't necessarily have the luxury into a startup world in there. So I think there is something there. And by the way, as a side product, it gives you a lot of credibility towards your own CFO and towards your own teams when you don't necessarily defend that. It shows that it's okay to kill stuff and to move on to the one that really can go back into the core. The second piece to me is like, I'm fascinated by companies like Flagship pioneering in our world. I know Karim, you're involved with them. It's brilliant companies where all they do, they're the founders of Moderna, but what people don't know is that they've created probably 100 companies behind that. And they're not just an incubator. They put their own money where the mouth is quite far off. And the entire philosophy of the founder of Flagship is to start with what if? What if the world of mRNA could become effectively a platform? What if you were to design a healthcare company from scratch, but that would be a digital company where you have a software, which would be the mRNA type of platforms where the code can be done in 10 days, computerized, and then you get into a sort of hardware that is standardized, and then off you go, you reinvent the way that medicines is being done. But to apply that to plenty, to food as medicine, to apply that to sustainability, I think it's something really brilliant. And it still puzzles me of how does it come that many of us more incumbent often don't necessarily think enough in terms of what if, because we have the means, we have the assets, we have the balance sheet, we have the smarts, we have the brains, but how do we bring that much more in? I think there is really a lesson there. There is a great case study on Flagship in particular. And to me, the third one, I think we're being a bit tough on the case method. Personally, I'm a massive fan of the case method because I think what it did is, if I remember, we had what, 550 cases over the course of 2 years. I love multilinguals. I'd love to hire many more multilinguals, people who have seen plenty of different sectors, different industries. In my case, I love people who are able to do science, but at the same time, or biology and data science at the same time. I'm thinking about that for my kids. How do we get them 2-3 different languages like those that will make them truly future-proof and to be able to invent stuff? In sustainability and food, how do you bring those two together? That's where magic really happens. And if we take the case method for what it really is, it creates an instinct in many of those, where you get a sense, you get a tease. And I would continue that into a career afterwards. It's like, how do you naturally keep that natural state of curiosity to jump into different departments, different companies, different sectors altogether? I think that way makes some very, very special animals that can scale and go fast while connecting dots.
Great. Well, look, we're at time. I just want to thank all of you for being so generous with your time. I really think of you guys as like people with amazing experiences that we've trained together and that we want to bring back. And I'm grateful to Janet and to the ER team for running these kinds of things. But the power is in our community. The lessons that we've learned together are just incredible. And that's why I was like super quiet, because I have a lot to say on these topics, but I want to learn. I'm like greedily learning from all of you. And so thank you again for being so generous with your time. I do want to share one thing in support of this re-engagement with alumni and how we do that is, in January, we have this short intensive program curriculum set up now. So I'm running one on the business of AI. And I'm going to do a hack at HBS and like invite alumni to also join with our students on this session. So it's January 18th to 21st. It's on HBS campus. It's limited enrollment. Each day focused on a single industry: healthcare, finance, tech. And there's a cohort model for alumni. If you're interested, join us for a one-day commitment. There'll be case discussions, startup incumbent panels, design thinking sessions, and we'll work with MBA students, other alumni, industry leaders. And I'll put this form up on the chat as well, so you have it. But we'd love for you guys to think about it, joining us. And let us know. Again, there's a good chance this is going to get killed by the MBA program because I haven't asked for permission. I'm just doing it. Hopefully we can host some of you with us on campus, working with our students on these topics along the way. So thank you again for this. And with that, I'm going to bring it to Janet, and I'll post on chat the URL as well for this.
Let me just say, wow. Karim, Jimmy, Bertrand, Mina, and Michelle, that was an extraordinary conversation. We've had a whole bunch of alumni reach out saying they want the recordings ASAP, like when is it coming out? Because there were just so many learnings from your conversation, not only for us at the school and the MBA program, but obviously all businesses, right? Whether you're incumbents or insurgents, the discussion was really phenomenal. And I was going to point out, Karim, as Michelle actually commented when we were all together, that this group, right? All of you, I think, are so illustrative of the impact that our alumni have in broad and deep ways across so many sectors in the world. And so I think it's extraordinary. Thank you. It's really been terrific. For our alumni who are joining us, we have our next session on December 1st, which is going to be Leading Glass Shattering Organizations with our director for the Gender Initiative, Colleen Ammerman, and Boris Groisberg, whom I think was on earlier with us today. So thank you everyone for being with us. We're going to close out with a short video, but stay well, and hopefully we'll see you on December 1st.
The most powerful thing that I got from the Harvard Business School was to learn how to learn.
On what we call the right of boom.
Reimagining capitalism, 6 minutes.
Well, once in a generation technological shock.
And you're listening to Cold Call.
In this episode of Skydive, Pandemic's Impact.
It created a lifelong network of people with whom to do business.
It's really about thinking about the future and what I want to continue to learn.
One of the things that's profoundly changed my career is the invaluable network of other HBS alums getting together and talking about opportunities for all of us to continue to grow from and learn from one another.